Thank you so much, Jan Gooding, for joining us today for our Qantabs series. It's really, really exciting to talk to you as a Cambridge LGBT graduate who's had an enormous impact on the LGBTQ movement here in the UK, and also on your field of brands, marketing, and business. I wanted actually to start by talking to you about your views on leadership. You've played quite an important role in many leading companies in BT, British Gas, Aviva, and you've recently given the Ogilvy lecture in Scotland, where you emphasized, you challenged business to really step up to make braver decisions about increasing trust in how businesses are run. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about why is trust so important to leadership today, in your view?
Well, thank you for having me. It's always lovely to talk to you, and yeah, what a great place to start. Trust is such an elusive issue or aspect of leadership, and of course it's an outcome of good leadership or not. So you can't be trusted without proving that you are trustworthy, and there's a number of things you need to do that, one of which is to be competent. Which I think a lot of leaders forget. It's not all about charisma and having big ideas, but I think as I've thought about leadership, one of the things that I've discovered is that whilst you need to be competent, you don't have to always have subject matter expertise. So I think the biggest thing about leadership is having a vision and having ambition about something that you think ought to happen, and then enrolling others to help it be delivered. And I think the difficulty in business, and the reason why I was speaking so forcefully in the Ogilvy lecture, is that profitability and short-term tactics have got in the way, actually, I think, of the big picture. And I don't think enough leaders have thought about their legacy. So for me, one of the ways I try and think is what am I going to leave behind? It's a sort of attitude of paying forward. So if you were to be the next person inheriting this agenda, what would you hope to inherit? Which I think turns it on its head, doesn't it? Because I think very often people will talk about what did they achieve whilst they were leader, whereas I think you should think about what was achieved by the leader after them, because of what they had left behind and how they had set up for success. And I think the current state of the planet and the imperatives that we're facing around the climate emergency and so on, I don't need to list all the scary things we're facing. If ever there was a more important moment to think about what am I doing for the generation that comes after me, it is now. So I think leadership really must address that idea of we have borrowed the future of somebody else. Yeah. I think somebody much cleverer than me made a comment about in a way we are all here as renters of the future and of the next generation. I think this is an incredibly important thing, and I don't think business has thought enough about it. Certainly in marketing, I delivered another lecture a couple of weeks ago talking about the need for marketers to be responsible, because actually marketing as a discipline sounds accused of unleashing an era of wasteful consumerism that I think we now have to address. And I actually think marketers are very well placed to address the overconsumption of the world's resources. Yeah. But we do have to stand in the shoes of what we've created and turn around and try and fix it.
Yeah, well, we'll talk in a minute about your role in Stonewall, your 6 years as chair of the Board of Trustees at Stonewall. But but following up on what you've just said about marketing and wastefulness and cleaning up and the next generation, you've recently taken over as the chair of Given, which
Yes.
is a brand purpose agency. Well, what is a brand purpose agency, and do brands need to have new purposes, and what is John Lewis doing with their brand, because I know you're working very closely with them on their rebranding?
Well, brand purpose is one of these phrases that has become abused, I guess is how I feel. And really by brand, that's a shortcut to saying the organization. And I think where the application of brand purpose has been misunderstood is when it's simply been applied to what's the advertising and marketing doing for a brand, as opposed to what is the organization, what is the business model of the brand, and therefore is it purposeful? And the thought was that it was about what was your idea beyond making a profit. So one of the problems that I think it was Milton Friedman who talked about, it's not up to business to think about society. Business is simply there to make profits. This is something that is now pretty much rebutted by everybody, hasn't led us to a good place. And the idea of brand purpose was trying to redescribe, why does this business exist? Why does this brand exist? And thinking about purpose beyond profit, therefore, means thinking about one's impact on society, the sustainability agenda, almost the right to produce, because actually you've thought about the circular economy and you can reproduce because you're operating in a sustainable way. And it's a big business idea. I mean, it's as powerful for a business as a digital strategy if you really take on board brand purpose. John Lewis, is an organization that is over 100 years old. And what was dramatic about John Lewis forming a partnership was that at that time, the labour market was treated very differently. So the thought of the employees owning the enterprise was an absolutely radical idea 100 years ago, and was intended to sort of drive out lots of appalling working practices that existed at the time. And the idea being that if the employees, as it were happy and they were running the business, they would by definition do the right thing by customers because they would want it to be a profitable enterprise. That's a given, because otherwise they've all got no jobs. So the idea was the self-interest of the staff would lead to better outcomes for them and ultimately for the customer. So here we are 100 years later. I think the rest of the world has probably caught up with a lot of good employment practices. And so what they've done is had a complete review. They were driven to do anyway. Let's not shy away from the fact the whole retail sector is having an existential crisis at the moment. And certainly if you're in department stores, that's not a good place to be sitting. But given that we need to have a radical rethink, they have a new chair, Sharon White, who has taken the opportunity to have a root and branch review, out of which comes a much more exciting for the next 100 years strategy, which is more profoundly rooted in the sustainable and responsible business agenda. So they're talking about, or they've got really ambitious targets for leading the made to last movement, as it's called. So the idea that when you consume, there will always be opportunities to either sell it back or replace or rent rather than consume and throw away. That sort of idea is very exciting for a player as big as John Lewis. And they're even talking about going into social housing, for instance, so using their property estate in a completely different way. So that kind of thing is exciting to me. And that's why I was, when the Given agency, they're about 10 years old, when they approached me and asked me to be their chair, I thought this is exactly the kind of organization I want to spend the rest of my working time on, because they're doing good. and they already work with people like IKEA and Aviva and many others, organisations who are really trying to radically rethink their business models.
I can see exactly what you mean, that calling it a brand purpose agency really understates what it is, because it's what's behind the brand that we're really talking about. And I suppose in a way it's the givens that are behind
Yes.
the brand, and also what you're going to be giving back. Which brings us around to another question I wanted to ask you today. There certainly are a lot of givens up in the air right now, in the midst of so much disruption, and at the same time, the question of, what will we be giving back to the next generation next, as things are rebuilt as a result of so much economic disruption and so much loss, so much grief, so much social grief about what has happened. And so I suppose this is at one level a real opportunity for exactly what you've called for, which is brave changes to the script, as it were, for marketers and for business. And in order for that to happen, there will need to be both different kinds of business leaders and different kinds of business cultures. And when I look at your career, that's what I see you doing, building different kinds of research cultures that have to be, to a certain extent, led by different kinds of research, different kinds of business leaders. So can you just say a little bit about your role in helping to coach and mentor leaders, which is something else that you've done so much of? Is this a time when, new kinds of corporate leadership can emerge? Is that possible, or will there also be the pushback to a more conservative view of the more Milton Friedman view of more profit orientated strategies because of the economic impact of COVID?
Well, of course, I'm a natural optimist, so I'm determined to see the opportunity for change. But I honestly, I think the change in leadership in the States is very important, really important, because that's a very powerful economic entity, the United States, and therefore the attitude of the politicians and the environment that they create really count. But regardless of that, I would observe that there is a different kind of chief executive emerging in the world, who I would describe as both entrepreneurial and enlightened. And what I see is that if you are the CEO in an organization, first of all, you're very interested in the idea of not just having the shareholder as your main paymaster and the person to whom you have to provide returns. I think many chief executives have not enjoyed the quarterly reporting cycle and the race for return on capital and dividend payments. And I can remember when I joined Aviva, there was a bonus attached to the share price growing or not. That sort of thing has become deeply unfashionable. I also think it's become evident that there is no point being the chief executive of an enterprise that is effectively destroying itself, that eating itself, and that we're becoming so the drama of what's happening with the climate now is within sight of boards. So I think corporate governance is now requiring a different attitude. So who are the stakeholders? I think society and the earth, and the issue of inequality in the world has become mainstream. I think boards are absolutely concerned by it. And as a coach, the way I'm finding it's manifesting itself now, as I coach people, is the kinds of people who are attracted to me because they've seen what I've said, what I speak about, what I've done with Stonewall, is that they're deeply concerned with their workplace cultures and being more inclusive. And the enlightenment is that I think the business case has been made that more diverse brains solving problems leads to better outcomes. Actually, you don't want groupthink. You don't want, and this is not just about gender. This is about everything. The richness of all of our different lived experiences, our different kinds of education, our protected characteristics, such as we all have them, because all of us tick all the boxes on everything. I always find it very peculiar when someone says, oh, I don't tick any boxes, and you go, what? You mean you don't have a gender, you don't have a ethnicity, you don't have a sexual orientation? Of course you do, everybody does. So we're all unique and we're all interesting, but we do want to build into our teams greater diversity of thought, and then we need the cultures that allow people to feel they can speak up. So I think there's been far too much attention given to diversity and not enough attention given to the aspect of inclusion. So being an inclusive leader in the business world, where you're enlightened about the idea of this is not just about the share price and the dividend, but actually it's about what I leave behind, and it's about how I can create a culture where we're going to be more successful because it's been proven that the productivity is greater, profitability is greater, outcomes are greater where you have a diverse workforce. They ask me to coach them because they know I get it, and it's how I didn't have any of that language, Sarah. I mean, when I was trying to be a leader, I think I was much more conscious about being a woman amongst men than anything else. And I was aware that I had been brought up outside the UK, and then, yes, I'd been educated here, but I didn't fit in the class system, and I didn't fit in with the gender norms of any of the organizations I worked in. I kept being the first woman this, the first woman that. So I must admit that I was very conscious of being my difference because of my gender. And I welcome the fact that everybody's just thinking way more broadly than that. But I didn't have the language to say, I want to be an inclusive leader. I just didn't want to be the kind of leader that I saw around me, which was very patriarchal and command and control and authoritarian, and I saw a lot of unfairnesses in the way things happened, the way recruitment happened, the way promotions happened. Even the behavior in meetings day to day was not right. You know, who was listened to, how it seemed to happen, what seemed to happen after the meeting. You know, even when you tried to have an open meeting where a decision was made, you would discover it would all be unraveled in the men's room afterwards, or in the break, or whatever it was. I mean, really, we talk about microaggressions these days, which I think is really helpful because we're all learning to understand that. But in working culture, the behaviors that I saw, there were just these subtle disadvantages that you felt you had all the time. If you were a woman and you were the only woman in the meeting, you went to the loo in the break and the men all went somewhere else. Yeah. And you'd all reconvene 10, 15 minutes later, and something would have happened, something had changed, and you were not part of it. And it sounds trivial, but it wasn't trivial. Yeah. And the more senior you got, the more difficult it was. So the more we think about how we're going to be inclusive, now we've got all this wonderful diversity around the table, I just think we're all going to be so much happier and better off.
Yeah, I totally hear what you're saying about how, you know, it's one thing to make a workplace more diverse in terms of, say, hiring people from more diverse backgrounds and so forth. But then there's really a whole different set of questions about how do you take a more diverse work culture forward. You can't just expect to bring everyone in and use the exact same kind of working culture that you had before. You have to have new kinds of working culture too. It seems when you mention microaggression, it does seem that we're becoming much more conscious of issues of behavior in the workplace, about behaviors that cause other people stress, behaviors that cause other people to feel uncomfortable. And there's a growing awareness that those can be, as you might say, sort of apparently quite subtle or minor things,
Mm.
but they can have quite big effects on other
Mm.
people. I wanted to ask you, is it important for the workplace to be more open to vulnerability and to failure and to the sort of open expression of when things aren't working? Is that really part of the way this change has to come about? There has to be more openness, both about individuals failing and about projects that fail and about things. It's an irony that we always learn a
Oh,
lot more from the things
yes.
that don't work than the things that do, but it seems like we're going to have to pay a lot of attention to the things that don't work, which a lot of people don't want to do in leadership positions.
That's right. That's right. And I mean, again, you know, I'm like everyone else, I'm learning the language of all of this because part of the opportunity is learning how to talk about things that are quite embarrassing. Because if you have upset someone about something small, they not only have to have the courage to tell you, but you've also got to react in a way where you're not affronted. And I think certainly in the UK, we get very embarrassed about being shown up. And because we tend to have authorities and structures of authority, you know, what can you say to someone more senior than you, and all that kind of stuff. So I think there's going to be a lot of choppy water and upset, because I don't think feedback's probably always going to be given well. And I think when people slight you, you've also got to have a heart which is, you know, offering forgiveness as well. There's a lot we have to do to work together to create the environment where these difficult and honest conversations can take place. But to your point about mistakes, I saw the most fascinating lecture about psychological safety at work, in which I want to be able to tell you the name of the brilliant woman from Harvard who was doing the lecture, but essentially I'll find it and send it to you afterwards. But what she was saying was the reason this notion of psychological safety emerged, which is where people feel able to speak up and it is well received, and you have like a learning culture, because that's the whole point of feedback. The point of speaking up is in order to learn, in order to do better. And she said she came across it because she did an analysis of two teams working in a hospital, where the higher performing team, when she looked into it, had more failures logged. And she thought, how can this be that on every other measure, this team versus that team is high performing, and yet the very same high performing team in terms of outcomes are logging the most errors and the most mistakes, which you can imagine in a hospital environment is the most difficult reporting environment of all, because often it is about, you know, near misses in terms of life and death, or there have been the consequences of death. And this is where she uncovered this very fascinating thing, that the reason the team that were high performing was because they were not afraid to report near misses or mistakes. Because I think a near miss is as important as, you know, did it actually end in a disaster? Because often what we describe as a mistake is something went wrong, but how about something almost went wrong, but we're still able to talk about it? And it meant that because they reported more near misses and mistakes, they learned faster, they improved the way it worked, and so actually their outcomes were more successful. So I think sometimes we've been too narrow in our thinking about, there's always the Edison light bulb, isn't it? You know, how many light bulbs he made that didn't work before the one that finally did. So I think we all understand this idea that sometimes you have to practice and experiment, and eventually you get the breakthrough. But I think in a working culture, it's not the same as that. It's not about, I must solve this problem and I must try again and improve and then the thing will work. It's actually how we work together as a team. And most work is about interpersonal relations and how we're working together as a team. And the more we're able to be open with one another about our doubts and our fears and what went wrong and what might go wrong and the risks that are around something, not so we then don't move. I mean, we've still got to, as teams, come to a conclusion. And I think one of the challenges of being an inclusive leader is eventually you're the leader, you make the call. So you listen to everybody, but then you will make the call. And that means somebody didn't feel heard, or maybe they were heard, but for whatever reason, the balance of risks meant you cracked on regardless. So I think to be an inclusive leader is very challenging, because you're going to hear more conflicting advice. Yeah. But the important thing is to be up for hearing it, and to try and get the whole team owning this idea of, look, we will learn, we will be a learning team if we're able to have these conversations. And actually that leads to higher performance. It's fantastic. So the more mistakes you make and share, the better you'll be, which is completely counterintuitive, but it's attached to this idea of psychological safety at work.
I mean, it makes sense that acknowledging failure increases trust, because it's during failure that you learn to trust people more, because you let your barriers down and you're more vulnerable. And what you've just been saying about having to listen, to learn, to acknowledge failure, to be a leader and to take decisions does also describe in many ways your role at Stonewall, where for 6 years you had to wrestle with some of the most difficult issues that organization has had to deal with. And I wonder if we can turn to talk a little bit about that, because your role as a leader of that organization was to preside over an extremely difficult set of discussions about race, about trans issues, and you had to be a listener and a decisive leader. So can you say, what are some of the things you learned from that context of leadership? Because it's obviously not a business, but it has things in common.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I'm incredibly proud of my time at Stonewall, and I'm just so grateful when I look back on it that we made the decisions as a board that we did. I mean, it wasn't, I don't want to make out I was just some heroic leader. We had a fantastic chief executive in Ruth Hunt, and we had a good board. But I suppose there were two big leadership moments. One is that when I took over as chair, it's embarrassing to say, but for reasons of history, Stonewall only campaigned for gay rights. It did the LGB and not the T. And this seemed an increasingly strange position for Stonewall to have, because it was the most famous gay rights organisation. Actually, it's the biggest in Europe, not just in the UK, attached, along with many other gay rights campaigners, but was attached to huge progression in the preceding 25 years. Stonewall was 25 years old when I took over as the lead. And as you know, employers, rightly or wrongly, have this category they call LGBT, sexual orientation and gender identity lumped together. Now a bit like the term BAME, it's not something anyone asked for, but it's what had happened and become common parlance. And it was very difficult to explain why were we not trans inclusive in our work. But it wasn't something we could just say, well, we're now going to do, attach the T. Stonewall's got to a point where it's now going to campaign for trans inclusion as well. We had to earn the right to do that, because for 25 years we hadn't been. So for me, it was a huge lesson in careful consultation and allowing someone else to voice what they needed ahead of you. So it was a real lesson in humility. It wasn't me who had excluded trans people, but I was chairing the organisation that many trans activists felt had actively excluded and harmed them. And we were seen to be wealthy, we were seen to be powerful, and we had not lent any of that to help them. So I, with Ruth, spent 18 months meeting with and listening to the trans communities and accepting all the feedback, which was tough. about how Stonewall had behaved, and owning that, and not saying, oh, but that wasn't me, you know. So the tough thing as the leader is to take responsibility for the organization that you're leading and what has happened in the past. And then the hard thing is actually doing and demonstrating how you're going to be different. So we set up a trans advisory committee, and they set out the manifesto for the trans communities, which was delivered to the board to deliver. And then we set out on our journey. And actually, what I didn't know when we did that work was what was going to happen politically, and that Theresa May was going to decide to change the terms of the Gender Recognition Act, and all the hideousness, that toxic discourse that then came from that. But at least it meant, which again, Sarah, it's funny, isn't it? Because I didn't know that was coming down the tracks, but because we'd taken the trouble to do the work and have an incredibly inclusive and humble reconfiguration of what Stonewall was, we then had the credibility to help the trans communities when everything kind of hit the fan, without using any rude words. On race, again, that was not something I had anticipated as being such an issue. But of course, why would it be any different? I mean, for those who don't know my history, I didn't fall in love with a woman until I was into my 40s. So I hadn't always been part of, as it were, the gay community. So I was not aware of the hideous and insidious racism that goes on. Really quite shocking, even up until recently, you know, dating apps where people of colour are frankly abused and told they're not wanted, and in the most appalling and disgusting terms. I mean, I've been shown by people some of the things that are said. I mean, absolutely shocking, but somehow hidden away. It's like the dirty little secret of the community, that racism was not only as bad as in society in general, but somehow even crueler. I mean, to me, the idea that you know, a young Asian man might go on a dating app tentatively for the first time, aged 18, full of hope, to actually meet somebody and meet racist abuse in no uncertain terms. And for me, I found it an unbearable idea that people who were already vulnerable, trying to come out, trying to have relationships, trying to find love, for heaven's sake, and were being met with hate. And I was lucky enough to recruit Lady Phil onto my board, who founded UK Black Pride. I say lucky enough because I was learning all the history and the context of the LGBT communities as chair. So I learned a lot really fast, and Lady Phil applied to be a trustee. And I remember when I interviewed her, we had such a profound conversation. We both wept. I was deeply moved by her history and what she'd done with UK Black Pride. So I think both with the trans inclusion agenda and on the racism that was going on within the LGBT community, I just was led by my heart. You know, I may not have had the experience directly myself, or even all the understanding of the whys and wherefores we were where we were, but I felt very, very strongly with my heart that these were two terrible wrongs that had to be addressed. And that's what helped me through all the shenanigans that you then subsequently go through. And racism within Stonewall as an organisation and within the community is absolutely a work in progress, because I'm afraid, as the summer has shown, structural racism is here, and why should that be any different for Stonewall or the LGBT communities? We are all in the same swamp, as it were, and we've all got to do the work to move on.
Yeah.
So I learned a lot. I learned a lot from Lady Phil, from Sheldon Mills, who's now the chair, who's taken over from me, from Mohsen Zaire, who's just written this wonderful book, A Dutiful Boy, as a, growing up as a young gay Muslim man in the East End of London, and in fact going on to Oxford, and now a successful barrister. So I was very lucky to have right in my board and right in my team people who, with kindness and gentleness, educated me and made sure that we were being ambitious in what we wanted to achieve.
Yeah. Well, it is very moving what you describe, and it's impossible to listen to you without realizing too how emotional a good leader needs to be, and yet the emotion needs to be the emotion that you hear from other people without your own emotion, necessarily being the center stage. And I suppose, learning how to do that, learning how to make the space for the things that need to be said, and need to be said again and again, and need to be heard, and to take that and to translate that into greater inclusivity is a really amazing legacy to leave to the next leader of Stonewall, the next chair of the board of trustees of Stonewall, Sheldon, who you mentioned. Yeah, it brings us back to what you said at the beginning, that you think of leadership very much in terms of what are you going to leave, leadership for the next for the next person in charge. And so you do leave a very different Stonewall for that group of people, and you leave a model of how to do that as well, passing that on. So will you be having a role with Stonewall from here? I suppose you will be stepping back, but perhaps you'll still be a bit of a mentor and a coach when needed.
No, well, I am one of the most important things, I think, when you stop being the leader, actually, is to toddle off. So I stepped down from the board a couple of months ago, but I remain as an ambassador. So I remain available, and absolutely Stonewall for me, I carry Stonewall with me, and they know that I'd be there like a shot. I take huge interest in what they do. Nancy Kelly, who's the new chief executive, is an absolutely brilliant woman. So I mean, that was the last thing I was able to do was recruit the next chief executive. I mean, often as chair, maybe that's the two things you're doing is trying to lead the board and set the strategy, and is that being ambitious and clear, and then do you hold to it in spite of the headwinds? And boy, were we tested. When you get the national press weekend after weekend saying, Stonewall's lost the plot, that creates potentially a lot of pressure for me and from the board. So leading everyone through, so we remain confident in our strategy and the rightness of that strategy. Execution may change, but the goal remains the same. And then I suppose it's the hiring of the chief executive, and I hired Ruth Hunt as the chief executive, and now Nancy Kelly. And Ruth was outstanding, and I'm absolutely sure Nancy will be too. So I'm very proud of that. I think who you recruit into your team, who I recruited into the board, those are the things that I'm pleased about, because it's a shared enterprise. I do realise you stand as a figurehead, and there were absolutely sleepless nights that I had, and calls that I had to make, and things that were kind of on me, because ultimately that is what happens when you take on the mantle of being leader. But clearly nothing gets done unless there's a team supporting you in it and helping you deliver, because one person can't just do it on their own. So the system you create around you is incredibly important. And Stonewall has amazing supporters. I mean, Lord Cashman, the original chair, he mentored me. David Isaac, who was the chair for 10 years during most of that change in legislation. Another Cambridge graduate, he mentored me. Chris Smith, who's your master at Pembroke, he has always been a real ally to Stonewall. I mean, Stonewall is rich in its influence and the people who give their time. And like me, you know, we're in the spotlight for a moment, but we never really completely go away. So there's an incredible alumni of people who still stand behind Stonewall. And I have to say, in spite of what you read in the paper, our revenue went up every year, and the impact we had went up every year, and our support went up from corporates to individuals. So I know that what Stonewall was doing was bought into by the people who matter, actually, because if I go back to my analysis of stakeholders, we don't have at Stonewall, there are not shareholders, nor are there actually members. It's not a membership organisation, but we did have the buy-in, it seems to me, of the mainstream and the people who in every generation, the people who I would care about what they thought, completely behind us. So I know we were right. And people talk a lot about, are you on the right side of history? But I absolutely know that Stonewall is doing the right stuff.
Yes. Well, taking us back to an earlier period in history, you know, you said you didn't fall in love with a woman until you were 40, and it was presumably about 20 years before that you were in Girton, where you enrolled in 1978 and studied economics, and you had some distinguished classmates, I believe, in Girton at the time. And I wonder if you could just tell me a little bit about your experience at Cambridge when you were there studying for your degree.
Well, it's quite, I read economics, and it was a very interesting time to come to Cambridge because Keynesianism and Cambridge economics could not have been less fashionable. I mean, it was all about monetarism. So frankly, just the degree I did at that time, it was very interesting to be at Cambridge. And I'm extremely pleased that I describe myself still as a Keynesian. I was lectured by Joan Robinson, she was still alive. And whilst I think the Cambridge School had slightly lost their way because the only policy idea they could come up with at the time was to have import controls because they had a very protective attitude to British industry, which I don't think was right, because I think you do need to reform and move on. But nevertheless, the whole idea at the heart of Keynes that people behave according to their expectations and not because of pure market rules made a profound impact on me. And that's why I ended up in marketing, because I just think why people do what they do and think what they think is endlessly fascinating. And that's really what drives economic behavior. Now we have behavioral economics kind of describing and capturing all this, which nobody thought about. I was very lucky because at that stage, econometric modeling wasn't really a big thing. So I wrote essays longhand in using words. So I wasn't required to, I had to do a statistics paper, and I got a third, which was rather shameful. But I was still able to do my economics degree without a lot of computing or mathematics. I'm sure that's very, very different now. I'm sure there's much more econometric modeling as a given. I'm sure you have to be a much better mathematician than I was. But the other thing that was very interesting at the time was, of course, I voted for the first time, and I did actually vote for Margaret Thatcher because there was this huge political change, and it was very thrilling to have a woman as a prime minister. I mean, it's so hard for everyone to think about that now, but actually whatever your politics at the time, my goodness, was that an exciting moment. Because when I came to Cambridge, there was only one woman to every 7 men. Can you believe it? I think in my year, Trinity College was mixed in my year. The year after me, Girton went mixed. So I was the last era of only women. But that happened because so many women were being attracted to go to what had been the old men's colleges. And I think by the time I left, the ratio had changed to 1 woman in every 4 men. So imagine in those 3 years, the university was literally transforming underneath me in terms of the gender balance, which was quite extraordinary. There was about to be massive unemployment, and times were tough. So when I graduated, you know, the job market was not great. I mean, a bit like I think people are probably feeling now. I know I graduated into the highest unemployment, and in fact, I think we haven't matched it for 40 years. I hope we don't get back to that again. But I lived in the Bahamas, so I was a little bit different to other students. I would go home to the Bahamas every holiday. And the real sadness that I think blighted my time at Cambridge was that my mother died in the first term of my second year. So in fact, to my joy, she came and saw me in my first term. She came over from the Bahamas with me in that rather old-fashioned, you know, helping me pack my trunk kind of way. And sadly, she told me 4 days before I arrived that she had cancer that had come back. So I arrived with this awful cloud over me, and sadly, a year later, she died. So that did blight some of my enjoyment of the university, but I do look back on it with great pleasure. It was an extraordinary time. I met some fantastic people. I mean, Sandy Toxvett used to kind of entertain people with her jokes in the queue as we, you know, went into hall. I mean, I didn't know she was going to end up being Sandy Toxvett, if you could see what I mean. There was just this rather amazing small blonde woman sort of making all these quips all the time. I wish I could remember some of the things she said, but she was very, very funny to be anywhere near. But I had no idea that she was gay. And interestingly enough, although I didn't know my own, I suppose, bisexuality as it turns out, I'm very reluctant to put labels on anything. But I cannot tell you that there was no sense at all of anyone being gay. I mean, when I think back on it, you know, subsequently, people who were like best friends, who I knew really, really well, I discovered years later that they were gay, that they were in relationships with one another at Cambridge. And I genuinely had absolutely no idea. And it wasn't talked about, and it was rather frowned upon. I can remember a very extraordinary moment. I had a very close relationship with another student, which was not sexual, but another friend, so-called, at Girton. I remember in the holidays going for a walk and her saying, "There's something I want to ask you." And I said, "Oh, what's that?" She said, "Oh, so-and-so thinks you're gay, you know, because of your relationship with this other person." And I can assure you that it was not just a, "Would you like to come out with me and be yourself?" sort of question. It was there's this slightly shocking rumor about you going round, and is it true, sort of thing? Because as your friend, I kind of feel I have a right to know. I mean, the irony is that very friend, it turned out that the boyfriend she had, which was a rather asexual relationship that we all used to puzzle about, he was gay. So all of this is rather fascinating to look back on. There was absolutely stigma. I didn't realize it had anything to do with me, but I remember being very upset when I found out subsequently that friends of mine were gay and hadn't felt able to tell me. So I had more the experience of, I think, what you would describe as being an ally, kind of, why did you not feel able to tell me? But when I think back on it, I did nothing to signal that I was okay with it, because we just didn't talk about it. And who knows what conversations, which I now can't recall, but you know that awful thing that maybe people were making homophobic comments and I didn't speak up because I just didn't think to. You know, we've all learned so much more now about challenging jokes and language that you hear around you, but they were different times. So imagine the godfather of my son Charlie, John Ancliffe, who was one of my best friends, who I've got an album next to me here with him, in pictures. I didn't know that he was gay until 20 years after we graduated. In fact, when I fell in love with a woman, he mentored me about it. But I had only known he had been gay for like a couple of years. And I remember these extraordinary conversations that we had, which I found hugely supportive. I mean, there's the irony, isn't it? That he supported me, and yet I had not supported him because I didn't realize. In our 20s and our 30s, he used to come to Sunday lunch and I would say to him, would you like to bring anybody? And he'd go, no, I come on my own. So I just thought, oh, well, he's asexual and I mustn't probe and I mustn't be inquiring. He was actually living with his partner. When I, in return, went for dinner, there was just a load of people there. I didn't know that one of the men at that dinner was his partner. I mean, isn't that awful? It's awful,
yeah,
but it tells you everything about how it was.
Keep it to yourself. I think we should see his picture. Did you say you've got it in the album there?
I think I do. Yes, let me see if I can find it.
That's lovely.
Oh, these terrible pictures that I've got.
Oh, that's very special.
That's a picture of me. Can you imagine?
I mean, that's priceless.
Look at that scarf. I mean, it really does.
Oh, that's marvelous.
I know, it really does make me look of the time. That was when Thatcher was wearing all those enormous bows and stuff. And I don't know if I can find the one of John there.
Like Margaret Thatcher.
No, I didn't.
I don't know if we should record that.
No, I can't get my hands on it just now. Okay. But I'll yeah, he's called and the thing is, John died. He dropped dead at his desk just when I'd come out, fall in love with Lucy. I've never felt closer to him, and thank goodness we'd had all those conversations, because he died young. He had one of those massive brain hemorrhages at his desk, and that would have been 15 years ago.
Right.
And I spoke at his memorial service, because he was quite a grand fromage. I mean, as many students, they don't realise, we all go and we're students and we just have our friends, but actually Oxbridge people do end up with the most amazing jobs afterwards, and they become really influential. And I spoke, funnily enough, at his memorial service in this huge church in Knightsbridge, and Baroness Thatcher was in front of me because he was big in the Tory party. So I had half the shadow cabinet sitting in front of me. And I spoke to this. I spoke because they asked me, to speak as one of his Cambridge friends. And I spoke to my regret that I hadn't understood he was gay, and how glad I was that he had come out and his partner Rui was there. And now we all know, but how much I regretted it, and how wonderful that before the end of his life he'd been happy. Yeah. I cannot tell you, it caused a scandal. An absolute scandal.
Yes.
That I had spoken like that in front of the Conservative Party. I mean, the Conservative Party has changed a lot, even in 15 years.
Yes, even the Conservative Party.
Yes.
Although it's interesting that it was only last year that the first LGBTQ Alumni Association of Cambridge was officially launched. The LGBTQ Alumni Group of Cambridge was launched in 2019, and that's how long it has taken for there to be an official alumni group. Even though it is clear that Cambridge has an extraordinary alumni network of LGBTQ people. So thinking
and many of them describe having had
a
very painful time at Cambridge.
Yes, that's right.
Now I know, now that various people who literally, they were direct contemporaries. They were people, they were in my life every day. And And now they tell me how awful it was.
Yeah, no,
So,
it's a story we've heard
yeah,
a lot. Yeah.
yeah.
So,
I'm afraid so.
So this is a story that needs to be learned from too, just the way other difficult pasts need to be reckoned with. But what do you think Cambridge should be doing in this space? What can Cambridge be doing? How can Cambridge be contributing? How can the universities be contributing to the kinds of leadership change that need to happen, to the kinds of inclusivity that need to happen, the kinds of acknowledgement of failure that need to happen in order for change to really last and be passed on?
Well, I think there's two things, aren't there? Because there's Cambridge as a community and a place and the people who live and work there. So this isn't an issue just for the students. This is an issue for the staff. This is an issue for Cambridge as a university, as a place, as a village, as a kind of a small town, really. There is a lot to be done, and you have been amazing. I know you have. You and Chris have kind of got something going. So there's a huge amount that needs to be done for Cambridge University and every college in it to come out as an ally. I don't think that's been done. And I suspect that Cambridge will run into exactly the same issues that many of the boarding schools who have big foreign student intake run into, which is the apparent so-called culture clash between the attitudes of people coming from other parts of the world. Because let's face it, homosexuality is still outlawed in over 70 countries in the world, and in 5 it's a capital offence. So Cambridge University is going, because it attracts an international staff and student base, is really going to have to think through how it comes out as an ally, and how far it's prepared to be an ally, and at what cost, because that may mean that some people choose not to come to the university because frankly they're homophobic or transphobic or biphobic. So I think there's a huge agenda there around, genuinely, does Cambridge University and the colleges within them, do they take a stand as an ally on a subject which is still controversial? And then I think there's the other side, which is the work you do. And for me, just as with our colonial past, there is a whole important agenda around rethinking and relooking at our history, not in a blame game, but actually from an academic and intellectual point of view. I think what a fascinating thing to now apply a different lens to our history and get different information, different kind of evidence, and perhaps come to some different conclusions. I mean, that's what academia is all about. And I would love for Cambridge to become, and of course I feel this way because I feel much more attached to Cambridge as a university than I do to Girton as a college, or even frankly to my boarding school. Cambridge matters to me because I learned so much. It was the first place I ever went to in the world where I met the world. I met the United Kingdom. I met contemporaries who were from every part of the United Kingdom, every kind of educational background. That was my first experience of diversity. One of my best friends was from Singapore, and it wasn't just about the UK was present in the university, the world was present in the university, and I'm sure that's even more acute. I would love for Cambridge to be the leading centre of thinking about the impact of homophobia, transphobia and biphobia on the world. How does this kind of prejudice and discrimination distort the world? So I think there's, in exactly the same way that racism is doing it structurally, there is so much to study and understand, not just about our history, but actually our present and where we are being led. And for me, it's both. I think for Cambridge, there's an opportunity to be the leading thinker on the impact of prejudice and discrimination and how it distorts business models and public policy and health outcomes and inequality and all of that. But also, I suppose, primarily for the people who are in Cambridge. You know, my hope is that they feel themselves from the minute they walk through the door for an interview, and that no longer any student or any member of staff experiences what my contemporaries tell me they experienced, and which I unwittingly contributed to in my ignorance. I was a benign, ignorant bystander, not understanding, and I feel lucky to know that I had that experience, because it helps me understand how the majority of people who are perfectly benign don't realize that their benign ignorance is actually a problem. And so this idea of educating ourselves, reading, exposing ourselves to things is so important. We've got to, that's what doing the work means to me, that it's not enough to say, but I'm not. Well, how do you know you're not? You know nothing about it. Yeah. So I'm able to look back with some regret at my own ignorance, but the university could have helped me get there if it had had a different attitude itself. And I think the university needs to show students who are coming from every part of the world and every kind of culture what dignity at work is all about, and what respect for different points of view is all about. I'm not a fan of no platforming. I think we've got to hear the most hideous views and thoughts people have. We've got to hear them, because people have them. We've got to understand that, because otherwise we can't influence people to think differently. That's why, but I've loved marketing. It is possible to change people's minds. It's why I loved leading Stonewall. It's possible to get people to change their minds, yeah, and to behave differently. So we've got to be up for the ugly side of humanity, or we can't fix it.
Well, that's a very eloquent statement about how Cambridge can continue to deliver a purposeful brand at the same time that it can repurpose its brand to become even more encompassing and to lead in areas that really need to see these kinds of change. So I think that's a very beautiful place for us to come to a conclusion. And then I really want to thank you so much, Jan, for speaking so heartfully and so knowledgeably and so passionately about Cambridge and about the work you do, the work that you've done in marketing, the work you've done for Stonewall, the work that you've done building on your Keynesian economic training is a real force for change in the world, and above all is a model for how much that change depends on people being willing to listen, to acknowledge what they don't know, to fail, and to create forms of succession that enable other people to build a stronger foundation for the future. So I want to thank you very much for this interview, and
thank you. I've enjoyed it, and I mean, I hope you can always call on me. And there are so many of us. There are so many LGBT alumni who would jump at the chance to help the university. So there is huge untapped resources there. It's not just me.
We're definitely on our way.
Yes, you are. No going back now.
It's totally palpable, the changes we've seen, and I think you should put on your robe, and I should put on my LGBTQ, and yes, we should make an oath.
Yes, I'm going to put on my robe.
We should make an oath. I'm going to put on my Cambridge University rainbow.
Well, and I've got my what have I got here? I've got my pride. This is my pride whistle.
There you go, your pride whistle.
Well, because you run out
of my Q+ badge. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we can say that we solemnly swear.
Yes, we do.
To work together for the greater purpose of LGBTQ+ at CAM and all the things it represents for everyone.
Yes, absolutely. Well, touching hands on that. Absolutely. Thank you so much.